Christians have a high regard for human life. And the second is that Christians seem to have a low regard for their own lives. And this is a bit of an oxymoron, so let me take a bit to explain what's going on here. You see, for you and I, this is our first pandemic that we've ever dealt with. But for Christianity, Christians have seen pandemics come and go throughout the ages and have dealt with pandemics plenty of times in history. The first big one was in the year 250 during the Roman Empire. That one was called the Plague of Cyprian, and historians noted how Christians behaved differently during this pandemic. At its height, this pandemic was killing up to 5,000 people a day, and it lasted for more than a decade. The historian Eusebius said that the public deserted those who began to get sick and fled from their dearest friends. They noted that city officials and government officials would make sacrifices to their gods, but do nothing for their citizens. And people who had no one to care for them were pretty much left to die. People who got sick were put out in the street to suffer outside so that the insiders wouldn't get sick. The Christians found this to be intolerable. They set out to care for the sick and the poor, and people were shocked. Why were these Christians taking care of people who were meant to die, especially at the risk of getting infected themselves? They seem to have a high regard for the sick, but a low regard for themselves in this pandemic. And this legacy continued through the ages of history, that Christians have responded compassionately in times of pandemic. In the year 1527, there was a plague outbreak in Wittenberg. People were fleeing the city in order to get away from the sickness. But Martin Luther and his pregnant wife decided to stay in Wittenberg to minister to the sick. Now, I don't say all of this to create a tension here or a division between Christians and non-Christians. That's not what this is about. In fact, Martin Luther said that some people should flee the city under certain circumstances. But even if people, even whatever people choose to do, that Christians should not judge the decisions of others during times of pandemic. So I'll take that advice as well. I'm not judging anyone, but I want to just bring this up because I want to talk about why. Why do Christians have such a high regard for human life, but such a low regard for their own lives? Well, Christians have a high regard for human life because every life is valuable. God says that he created man, created people in his image. In Genesis 1:27, he says, God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Every individual, every person, rich and poor, peasants and kings, they all have a purpose and a plan and great value to God. And that means in the sight of Christians, every individual has great value as well. In fact, when people suffer and are in pain, then God's in pain because of that. God hates to see people suffer because everyone is so valuable. Everyone has the image of God in them. Jesus continued this teaching when he said that whatever you did for one of these brothers or sisters of mine, so you did for me. In other words, Jesus says, whatever you do for the sick and for the poor, you might as well be doing for God. In other words, treat others the same way you would treat God. Love them sacrificially. Jesus spent a considerable amount of his ministry healing people, feeding people. He didn't just care for their soul, he cared for their body as well. He told the story of a good Samaritan who crossed the street to deal with someone's suffering, but besides crossing the street, he also crossed racial divides, ethnic divides, religious divides to care for someone who wasn't his own clan, wasn't his own class. That's the call of the Christian, to cross these boundaries and divides to care for people with compassion. Jesus ascended and went into heaven, and quickly the church set up a system for caring for widows. Before we set up a system of pastors and bishops and elders and all of that, We set up a system for caring for people. It's a very high priority to Christians to care for people. Charitable hospitals is a Christian institution. Before Christians, hospitals were just for the people who could afford it, just for the military or the well-to-do people. But Christians thought that everyone should have access to health care, whether they're poor or rich, whether they're of this clan or that. And so they opened up hospitals to care for all people, to care for the public. And that tradition continues today. You've noticed all the Christian hospitals, right? Catholic and Good Samaritan, and there's just so many Christian hospitals even today. And so Christians have a high regard for human life. But at the same time, they have a low regard for their own lives. Some people consider what Christians do foolish, and that they're taking too much risk to their own lives and to their own health, and perhaps even spreading in the pandemic with all of the reckless care and love that they're trying to give to people. So let me explain why this is. Jesus taught us in so many different ways to love others. It's the most important commandment that a Christian can do besides loving God. Love others. In John 13:35, Jesus said to love one another as I have loved you. Well, what does he mean by that? You see, Jesus loved you, loved me sacrificially. He gave his life for us. So when he says love others in that way, he's telling us to love sacrificially. That means it might cost us something. It might cost our money, our time, our reputation. It might cost us our own lives. Hopefully it doesn't. But if it did, Christians don't consider that the worst outcome, to die, to sacrifice oneself for the love of others. Jesus said it another way. He said, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Elsewhere in the Bible, it teaches to count others as more significant than ourselves. And so again, I don't say all this to create a Christian and non-Christian mentality or divide or competition here. In fact, I want to use this opportunity to invite anyone who is not yet Christian to be a part of this compassionate movement. For 2020 years, Christians have been caring for the poor, caring for the sick, having compassion on those less fortunate. And so if you're watching this and you consider yourself someone who has a high regard for human life, boy, you'd make a great Christian. You'd find yourself in good company with us. And if you consider yourself the kind of person that has a low regard for oneself and considers and thinks that people should be compassionate and caring and even sacrificially loving others, if that describes your mentality, then hey, you'd make a great Christian and you would find yourself in good company among us. I'd love to talk to any of you about that in further detail if you want to send me a message. But for all the Christians watching this, I explain all of this to you, well, to educate you a little bit about the legacy of compassion that Christians have had in history through pandemics. I want to lovingly challenge you to carry on this legacy. How are historians going to remember the coronavirus pandemic of 2020? And how are they going to remember the Christians' response? Are they going to remember us as compassionate or as selfish? I know I examine myself and I think, boy, so far I've mostly just cared for my family, my own health, my own finances, but I've hardly taken any time to consider other people's well-being. And that's not what the legacy of Christians has been, and it's not what Jesus asked us to do. Now, Jesus doesn't ask us to be foolish or reckless and do things to spread the virus, but he does ask us to have compassion on the poor and to take care of the sick and do so sacrificially. And so my challenge to you is, have you been doing that? And how can you start today? How can you be compassionate and love and serve and take care of the sick and the poor among us in this coronavirus season? I love you guys. I hope you're doing well. Have a great rest of your week.